Stanford University.
Please join me in welcoming Bridget Martin-Hard. Thank you.
So as Kelly mentioned, I teach a class here at Stanford called Uniquely Human that describes a lot of research that I find to be some of the most interesting research going on in psychology. It's not research that I do, but more research that I wish I had done because I find it incredibly cool. And in order to sort of explain to you why this particular class is so important to me, I want to tell you a little story about how I became interested in psychology in the first place, which was because of my childhood hero, who some of you may recognize as Jane Goodall. I discovered books written by Jane Goodall in the library when I was about 8 years old, and would just spend hours upon hours in the library flipping through these books, looking at all the pictures of the chimpanzees that she had studied, and reading her fascinating observations of these animals. Jane Goodall is a field ethologist who spent her whole life, basically, in Tanzania studying chimpanzees, which are often referred to as trogs. So pan-troglodytes, here are pictures of a variety of different chimpanzees. And what made Jane Goodall so fascinating to me was her incredible patience. So she spent years just trying to get the chimpanzees to allow her to be in their presence. So this took an enormous amount of fortitude and persistence. And it paid off because over the span of several decades, she was able to make observations of chimpanzees in the wild that no one had ever known. So for example, she was the first to discover that chimpanzees use tools, for the most part involved in sort of fishing for termites in these little termite mounds, and that they seem to sort of learn how to use these tools by watching their parents, that they carry these tools around with them to plan for the future and things like that. And so what really enthralled me in studying some of Jane Goodall's work was this question of what it might be like to experience the world from the perspective of someone who's not human. So what it might feel like to be a chimpanzee. And this was really valuable to me because it led me to ask a different question, which is, well, what is it really like to be human? What is it that makes my experience different from the experience of a chimpanzee? And this, I think, is a really important question. How is it that we can look to other species, especially species that are closely related to us, and gain insight, gain a window into our own experiences as human beings? And this question is what forms the core of the course that I teach, and what's going to form the core of my talk today, is how can we look to non-human animals to understand something about what it means to be human? And there are a lot of different variations that we could ask on this question. And when we look at sort of the realm of living things around the Earth, we see incredible variety. And we can ask questions like, how are humans similar to other non-human animals? What makes us a lot like chimpanzees, and maybe a lot like monkeys and dogs and chickens and squirrels and all sorts of other living things? The question I want to focus on today is not what makes us similar to other species, but what really makes us unique, and specifically what makes our minds unique. What is it that sets humans apart from our closest living relatives, specifically thinking about chimpanzees? Now, if you look around you at the world, at sort of the things that we think of as human, what seems to set us apart from other animals is kind of astonishing. So humans build cities, for example, with these massive buildings, these huge skyscrapers and lights and bridges. We do mathematics. We think about the world in this numerical way. We do science to try to investigate questions systematically. We communicate with other members of our social group in a lot of creative forms. So we produce music, we produce theater, we draw pictures, and all sorts of interesting things like that. We farm. We actually go out and plant things in the ground and gather them up and share them with other people. We form institutions like universities where we can collect knowledge in books and share it with others. And so if you're thinking about all these different things that we see around us, and not only including these, but simply the fact that we have governments, it seems like the differences between humans and non-humans is endless. So the answer to the question, what makes humans unique, has to be everything. Everything makes us unique. Everything about us seems unique. But that's sort of a boring answer. And psychologists and evolutionary anthropologists have tried to look at all of these things that seem to make humans special, and to try to figure out what are the different threads that tie these different things together. Is there sort of a simpler thing that we can think about as being uniquely human that explains all of these different things that we see that humans do. And there's a few different ideas about this, and a real simple idea, an idea that we might first come to in thinking about this question, is that people, we are just generally smarter than chimpanzees. We're just generally smarter than other primates that are related to us. And by generally smarter, maybe we mean that we have an enhanced memory. We're able to remember things better. We learn faster. Maybe we have more robust logical reasoning skills. We're more rational in some way. Maybe we have a greater capacity for longer range planning, things like that. So maybe what makes humans special is that we're just really, really intelligent. We have these big brains that enable us to do all these different sophisticated things. So this is one idea about what makes humans unique. But there's a slightly different idea that I find really, really compelling that has been proposed by a guy named Michael Tomasello, who's the author of the papers that I assigned for you all. And his idea comes from this. So if you look at all of these different things that humans do, these things like building cities and doing math and science and music and farming and governments and universities, what do they all really have in common? Besides the fact that maybe they require some intelligence and big brains. And what Michael Tomasello has proposed is that, if you really think about all these different examples, there's something that really does unite them. They're not things that we do by ourselves. And in general, if you think about the greatest feats of human civilization, mathematics, science, written language, music, these are things that involve a group effort, that involve collaboration in some way. So human intelligence is not a solo effort. The things that we think of as being related to human intelligence are not things that an individual does. So even somebody like Albert Einstein, who we think of as accomplishing these incredible intellectual feats, had to work with other mathematicians. He had to build on the work that others had done in generations prior to him. He had to share ideas with other people. And so in general, the things that we accomplish as people, maybe we accomplish so well because we're able to put our heads together with other people and we're able to collaborate. And so because we can do this, because we can work together, put our heads together with others, we're able to do something really astonishing, which is we can accumulate knowledge and skills across individuals and across generations. And maybe this is really the key to human uniqueness. Maybe this is what really makes us so special, is this ability to work together and to accumulate knowledge and skills with others. So this different idea is that humans aren't just generally smarter. It's not that we just have like a faster computer in our heads. It's that our computers are fundamentally different in some way. It's that we're really socially smart. We're really motivated and able to share what we call psychological states with one another so that we can accumulate skills and knowledge. And this has been given a very special term called shared intentionality, or we intentionality. It's just this idea that humans are really motivated to put our heads together. Okay, so there's several examples of this, many examples of how we share psychological states with each other. So for example, we share our goals and our plans with one another by cooperating. So for example, you've got a piece of IKEA furniture that you've bought, and you're trying to put it together, and maybe you're recruiting your spouse to come in there and help you out, and you'll sort of sit together and think through, okay, well, we've got this goal, we've got to get this thing put together in this way, this is what it's supposed to look like, and you'll kind of coordinate with one another. Okay, well, hand me the screwdriver, let's put this in here, let's hold this panel up here, and because we can combine our goals and our plans to accomplish those goals, we can do things faster, more efficiently, we cooperate. We also can share beliefs with one another. This is a different kind of psychological state, attitudes that we might have. And we can use that sort of sharing of beliefs to try to persuade others to think the way that we think, to try to convince them that a particular political candidate is the one that they should vote for, or that, as I'm trying to argue to you today, that maybe there's something special about human uniqueness that relates to our ability to put our heads together. We also can share attention and knowledge. And we do this when we show people things, when we teach people things. So we try to get our heads together thinking about a particular idea, to focus our attention on something specific, and to try to sort of pass knowledge back and forth with each other. Okay, so this is a different way of thinking about what makes humans special. How do we test something like this? How do we explore whether this is really the key to what makes humans unique? And there are two sort of complementary approaches that I want to present you with today. One is what we call comparative evidence. And this is evidence that really asks, how do psychological processes compare across species? So we can look at evidence where you have humans try to do something and you have chimpanzees try to do something, and you compare how they do, and you see whether they're different. You see whether humans can do something that the chimpanzees can't. A complementary approach involves using developmental evidence. And so this involves looking at what the earliest developing abilities are in the human mind. So looking toward children. Looking to children who haven't had maybe the same experiences that we have had as adults, who haven't had the time to really kind of learn stuff, and seeing sort of what's sort of there by default, what seems to be kind of programmed in to the human mind that might be related to this idea of being able to put our heads together. And often we do combine these approaches, so it's often very useful to say compare human children to chimpanzees, where they may be matched on a variety of abilities. But if you see that the children do something that the chimps don't, that can really tell you something about what makes humans special, what makes them different. So let's actually look at some of this evidence. I'm going to present a few different pieces of evidence for you to try to think about this idea of human uniqueness. So a first piece of evidence is that human children, but not chimpanzees, have a motivation. They have a willingness, a kind of desire to share psychological states with other people, even when they have nothing to gain from doing so. Okay? And one of the first examples of this that we see in early childhood comes at around 9 months of age. This is actually my daughter. She's 3 now, but this is when she was 9 months old. And when she was 9 months old, she started to do something really interesting. She started pointing at things. How many people have kids? You have kids? Okay, so we all experience this. When your kids are about 9 months old, they all of a sudden start like doing this gesture at things in the world. And why do they do that? Why do they point at something? They want to show you. There's some desire, some motivation to share attention with you. It's like over here, and they're pointing at a bird. And the only reason to point at that bird is because they want you to look at it too. They want to share in this experience with you. And so from 9 months of age, children are motivated to share attention. And they will communicate with an adult in this cooperative way of like, I just want to show you this so that we can share the experience. So they not only produce pointing gestures, but they also begin to understand them as well. And this is sometimes referred to as the triangle, the sort of magic triangle that infants come to understand at 9 months. And the triangle refers to sort of the person who's doing the pointing, the person who's going to perceive the pointing, and then the thing out there in the world. So it's this triangle between me and you and that bird over there that I'm pointing to. And this triangle is very, very powerful as providing a foundation for a lot of human cooperative activity. So let me show you an example of a study done in Germany that's looking at this ability in children and also in chimpanzees to see whether children can do it and chimps can't. This laboratory is run by Michael Tomasello, and all of the studies are conducted in German. So if anybody speaks German here, you may understand some things about the situation that the rest of us don't. But this is from a video clip that's hosted by Alan Alda, and he is interviewing Michael Tomasello, who's going to tell you some things about this particular study. All right, so one thing that this study is showing is that really young infants, without even needing to be taught, if they're put into a situation with an experimenter where there's some appealing toy being hidden underneath a cup, if they see the experimenter just do something like this, they immediately infer, oh, you're trying to help me. And they'll use that point to get the information that they need. And so not only can they understand the pointing gesture, but they're sort of inferring this cooperation that's going on from the adults. They're inferring this kind of helpfulness. Chimpanzees don't seem to do this. And one thing that's puzzling about it is you may wonder whether chimpanzees are just like completely oblivious to other people's behavior, to human behavior, to chimpanzee behavior, to any behavior. Do they understand anything about sort of arms reaching out into space? It seems like such an obvious thing to us that if you saw someone doing this in a particular direction, that would be telling you something. And it turns out chimpanzees actually can use behavioral cues. They can use things in a human's behavior to get information. But they can do it in competitive situations and not in cooperative situations. So they're really quite smart. It's just that you see a lot of this intelligence in situations where they need to compete and not when they need to cooperate. So this is a study looking at this. And what they did in this little setup, sorry, let me just pull this plug out there. There we go. So what they did in this setup was to have a chimpanzee sort of in a little enclosure. He's in this cage back here. The chimpanzees are always separated from human experimenters with plexiglass. Which may not seem obvious to you, but I think is worth sort of pointing out that chimpanzees are really quite dangerous. and incredibly strong. And so it's very important if you do research with chimpanzees to have certain protective measures in place so that they cannot hurt you or fling feces at you. And so we've got plexiglass here to separate the chimp from the experimenter. And what's going on in this setup is there's two little cups here in the middle. And a second experimenter who's out of view here will obscure the chimpanzee's view of these cups and will then hide a piece of food underneath one of them. Okay? So there's something being hidden here, and the chimpanzee can't see where it's being hidden. Okay? So the next step is this little occluder comes away, so the chimpanzee can now see the cups. And this experimenter here on the opposite side is going to do one of two things. So in some cases, the experimenter is going to do something that seems quite cooperative to a human. The experimenter is going to point to one of the cups, and the human's always going to point to the cup that has the food. Okay? And after the human does this experimenter here will slide these cups toward the chimpanzee and give the chimpanzee a chance to choose one of the cups. Okay? Now, if we were in this context, we would choose the cup that the experimenter was pointing to, easy as pie, and we would get the food. Okay? Now, in another context, what the experimenter is going to do is not something cooperative, but something more competitive. So the experimenter here is going to do something like this, like reaching for one of the cups, always reaching for the cup that has the food. Okay? And after the experimenter does this experimenter will again slide the cups over to the chimp and allow the chimp to pick. And if the chimp picks correctly and gets the food, this experimenter is going to like bang on the plexiglass, like they're really angry that the chimp got the food when they wanted it. If the chimp guesses wrong, the cups slide back over here to the experimenter, and the experimenter gets to get the food. Okay, so there's this more competitive context where the chimp is competing with the experimenter to get the food. Now, what happens is we simply measure how often the chimp is right. How often do they get the food out of the cup? And what we find is that the chimps are really good at reading the human's behavior when they're competing. They're really lousy at reading the human's behavior when they're cooperating. So what this bar here shows you is the number of times that the chimpanzee gets the food, that they guess correctly which cup has the food in it. And this is the competitive case, and this is the cooperative case. And this line here represents basically chance. This represents 50-50 guessing between one of these two cups. And so in the competitive case, the chimpanzees are well above chance. They're fairly good, not perfect, but fairly good at getting the food. When they have to cooperate with the experimenter, they're really right at chance, so not significantly different from chance. This is dramatically different behavior than what we see in a one-year-old child. Okay? One-year-old children can do either of these things really, really well, and are able to do especially well in this cooperative case. Okay? So pointing is one example of children's early motivation to share psychological states with others. There's another example that comes a little bit later as children get a little more sophisticated at sort of being able to do stuff, physical stuff, like play with toys. So before the age of 2, children start collaborating with others in play. They start kind of playing with toys with other kids and with grown-ups. And they become really motivated to do activities together. Rather than playing by themselves, they really, really enjoy playing with other kids and also with their parents and other grown-ups. And now in this situation, when children are playing and collaborating on activities with their children, we really think that what's very important to them in these activities is the togetherness of it. It's the fact that you're doing this and I'm doing this and we're doing it together. And so in their mind, they have this idea of the activity as being about the togetherness, about doing this together. Now this doesn't necessarily have to be the case, okay? So it could be the case that this child is, say, playing with a sandcastle with this other child and is really just thinking about herself doing the activity, that the other child is irrelevant to the activity, okay? How do we tell the difference between these two things? How do we tell whether it's the doing it together that's really important versus just the doing it by yourself? So one approach to answering that question is to think about this situation. So we've got two kids building a sandcastle together. We've got one child sort of thinking about the building of a sandcastle, has this goal of doing this, and the other child has this goal of doing this. Now what we want to test is whether this child here is also thinking about this child thinking about the sandcastle. So whether there's sort of a triangle here going on between sort of this child thinking about the castle, and this child thinking about the castle, and then this child thinking about this child. So is this what's going on? Is this child really thinking about this togetherness, the fact that you're doing this and I'm doing this together? And one way to find out is to see what happens when you subtract this kid out of the mix. Okay, so I want you to, those of you who have kids, you can probably imagine this. I want you to imagine that you're playing some game with your child, and you're doing this together, and all of a sudden you just stop playing. Maybe your cell phone rings, you pick up your phone to answer a call, you realize something's boiling on the stove, so you run into the kitchen, and you disengage from the activity, okay? What does your child do when that happens? If the child is really thinking about the togetherness of this as being important, what will they do? They'll stop. Yeah, what else might they do? They might cry, so they express frustration. They might wait. What else might they do? Follow you into the kitchen, yeah. And if you have a whiny 3-year-old like mine, what might they do? Mommy, you have to play with me. So they actually communicate and try to re-enlist you in the activity. And the fact that they do that suggests that it's not just I'm doing this and you're doing this independently, but the togetherness of it is really, really important, okay? So what happens when you disengage? Will children sort of try to bring you back into the activity? And what about chimpanzees? What will they do in a similar situation if somebody that they're collaborating with disengages from an activity? So to investigate this question, Tomasello and colleagues designed some different tasks for children that would involve some kind of collaboration with an adult. And some of these tasks were problem-solving tasks where the children are going to work with an adult to get something, like a toy. And some of these tasks involve two people doing complementary things. So where you're not doing the exact same thing, but one person's kind of doing this role and the other person's doing another role. So for this task, for example, there is a toy inside this little coffee mug here. And what's required to get that toy out is that one person has to kind of reach in and lift up this little elevator. They have to kind of lift it up into this box. And once they've lifted up into the box, they're sort of stuck. They can't really reach around the box to get what's inside the cup. So that's where the partner comes into play. The second person is able to, from a different angle, reach in and grab the toy that's in the cup, okay? Now, some other of these problem-solving tasks involve parallel roles, where two people are doing the same thing. So this is kind of like a giant wrapping paper roll that has two handles on either end, and the tube here is too long for one person to kind of pull apart. But if you can get two people in the task, one person on either end, and pull this tube apart, it'll pop open and a little toy will come out, okay? So 2 tasks for kids. There were also some tasks they simply called social games. And these were tasks that involved just kind of doing things with a grown-up just for fun, like where there's nothing to be gained from it. There's no toy you're going to get. You're doing this really just for the whatever pleasure of doing an activity with somebody else. So this is a little double tube game where one person can kind of drop a block or a ball down one side of the tube, and then the other person on the other end can catch the ball in this little tin can, and it makes this great little rattling sound. This is a trampoline task where you've got this big floppy trampoline, and if you have 2 people, you can kind of like hold either end and then bounce a little block on it. Okay, now this may sound really boring to you guys, but to like a 2-year-old, this is really fun. And 2-year-olds found this incredibly fun. So they designed these tasks for children, and then they needed to come up with variations of these for chimpanzees. Okay? And this is not an easy task. So remember we talked about chimpanzees are very strong. These kinds of objects are things that a chimpanzee could destroy in like 5 seconds. So they needed to come up with different versions of these, and were able to do so. One of the main variations they had to make was taking that little elevator task, and they had to change that around a little bit. So they found that chimps didn't like to push things up. They didn't like to do that, but they were able to sort of like lift up doors. So they designed sort of a variation on that particular task that involved something like this. So you've got either a chimpanzee or a human who can kind of lift a little door on one side, and then another chimpanzee can reach into the box from this other side, go underneath that door, and then grab something that they want, which is most specifically food. One thing that they noted right off the bat with the chimpanzees was that chimpanzees would not play social games. So remember, for the kids, we've got this little tube game, a little trampoline game. The kids will do those. The chimps had absolutely none of that, which is telling in and of itself that the chimps would not do these cooperative activities when there was not food involved. Okay? But the chimps would play these, do these sort of games. And so the main question is, how does the behavior of the children and the chimps differ? And specifically, how does it differ when the partner disengages from the task, when the partner just stops doing what they're doing? So in these tasks, the experimenter who is partnered with the children or partnered with the chimpanzees, after they got the children playing the game, would simply stop what they were doing for 15 seconds and just fall silent and do nothing. And during that 15 seconds, they were really interested in what the children did. Okay, so what did you see? What did the children do in both of those cases? What were some of the behaviors that you observed?
They point to tell people what they want them to do.
They point, right? They point to tell people what they want them to do, right? So we've already looked at how children sort of use pointing, and here's a case where they specifically use it to try to draw your attention. Wait, you're supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be doing this. So they're clearly trying to re-enlist the adult. Anything else that you see them doing? Yeah?
I think he considered taking the can from the disengaged adult and trying to do the whole thing by himself.
Yeah, so that's another thing they might reasonably do in this situation is just see if I can do it myself. So maybe I can try to do my part and then run over here and do your part. Like maybe there's some way to do that, right? So they could attempt the task on their own. That's something else they might do. Anything else that you saw them do or that they might also do that maybe we didn't see? Yeah, they're in the back.
They were trying to bring the adult's hand over to or give the toy to them and make them do it. And they also were looking at eye contact.
Yeah, so they're maybe going over and actually trying to physically like move the adult around and like make them do their part. And also using eye contact, which seems to go along with the pointing as well. It's sort of like I'm looking at you and I'm pointing to try to get your attention over here. Yes?
Judgment. They were demonstrating judgment. Oh boy, he was going to go down a white tube and then he went, oh, black tube is where the tail.
Okay, so yeah, so noting other things that are going on in the task too, so that he's trying to coordinate his behavior with the adults, right? So first he's thinking over here, and then he realizes, wait a second, the adult's over there, so I should go here. So there's sort of looking and trying to coordinate behavior. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was smiling?
And he was smiling. Yeah, so there's this enjoyment of the activity, and in smiling, kind of communicating, I'm enjoying the activity. Mm-hmm. We'll take one more.
Well, I also got the impression that the child was doing things that he had seen adults do.
Uh-huh.
In other words, an adult that was trying to get the child to do something might have done all of those things. Pointed, reached out, smiled, made contact, etc. So to a certain extent, this might be learned behavior.
This is a really good question. So we're seeing the children doing all these things. The question is, how do they know to do those things? Are they things that they just spontaneously do, or are they things that they learn from an adult? And certainly, you're right, adults do all these things too, to children, you know. And I know for me, I'm trying to, wrangle the 3-year-old, and I'm like, no, come do this, and trying to tell her what to do, and I'm pointing and using eye gaze. That's a very good point. And so it's unclear from what we're seeing in this video whether what we're seeing is something that children are learning or something that they're just doing spontaneously. So what did the chimp do that was different? Well, acrobatics, that was definitely one thing. We didn't see the 1.5-year-old do that. Yeah. Frustration, right.
He tried to do it himself.
Tried to do it himself. So clearly went around and tried to do it himself. And the children may do that to some extent as well, but the chimp really seemed to do that. What did the chimp not do? Point, right? There's no communication going on there at all. And I just want to point out that there have been many studies done with these chimpanzees and with these caregivers where the chimps demonstrate that they do know how to communicate. So for example, if there's some food that they want, these chimps had been known to actually take a caregiver by the hand and like walk them over to something that they wanted to enlist their help. So they're capable of communicating, but in this collaborative activity, they don't seem to be interested really in trying to re-engage the experimenter. They'd rather just try to do it themselves. So we can look at a variety of different little pieces of these behaviors and we can compare them. The specific behaviors that the experimenters looked for in the children and the chimpanzees were these four. So one is re-engagement. So some attempt to sort of point or use eye gaze or something to try to communicate, I want you to get back into the activity. Simply waiting, just sort of sitting and just kind of waiting to see what would happen. Making an individual attempt, like running around and trying to do it yourself. And then disengagement. And disengagement might be something like the acrobatics that you saw the chimpanzee do, where they just kind of walk away from the task and start doing flips around the room, something like that. So for children, 18-month-old and 24-month-old children showed all of these different behaviors. They showed all of them, although one thing that they noticed from 18 months to 24 months was that there were gradually more attempts at re-engagement. So across time, the children seem to rely more as they get older on trying to like communicate with you and try to get you back in the activity that way. But they also would wait. They would sometimes make individual attempts, and sometimes they would just disengage. The chimpanzees basically showed 3 of these, but not the 4th. So the chimps do some waiting. They make a lot of individual attempts, and they do a lot of disengagement. But they don't try to communicate to the experimenter that they want the experimenter to do their part. So pretty striking differences between them in a task like this. And again, it suggests that children from an early age seem to care about the togetherness of an activity. Now, they may learn some of these strategies for sort of creating togetherness, sort of communicating, come back here and do this task with me from adults, but they're clearly motivated to do that. They're clearly motivated to do these things together and to try to enlist help when they need it. So I think that last point that he makes bears repeating, which is that even though the children are very clever, and if they play with these toys on their own, they're able to figure out how they work, they still will defer to a grown-up. So if there's an adult around who seems to know what they're doing, children will sort of wait and expect to be taught by another person, and then will modify the way that they do things in order to fit with the way that they've been taught. And this is something that Tomasello's lab has also looked at in chimpanzees, and you just don't see the same kind of thing. Although chimps can learn from other chimps, there's just not this teaching that we see in humans. There's not this sort of waiting and sort of expecting you to show me how to do this. And there's also not this cooperative, like trying to show you how to do certain things. So in addition to sort of showing this motivation to collaborate from an early age, young children also show, without being taught, a preference for other people who want to share psychological states. So in general, as grown-ups, we tend to like people who are cooperative, right? So we tend to like and want to interact more with people who, hold the door open for you when you're coming in, who offer to help you with a really challenging problem. And it turns out that really young babies, as young as like 5 months old, also seem to show these same preferences, which support the idea that there's something about this like putting our heads together that's really innately and uniquely human. So I heard you all react to that. And I think we have a bit of a reaction to that too, which is like, oh, that mean square. Why is he pushing the circle down the hill, right? And so there's sort of what we're pitting against each other in this particular little puppet show is that we've got a sort of a helpful, cooperative triangle who is sharing, in some sense, a psychological state with the circle. So it's going to share this goal of like trying to get up the hill, and we're going to do it together, versus the square, who's our hinderer, who rather than sort of working cooperatively with the square, is going to try to thwart with the circle, is going to try to thwart the circle's goals. So then what they do to try to understand, what do babies understand about this situation? What do they think about the triangle and the square? Do they have the same reaction that we do? And there are a few ways that you can ask babies this. Now, you can't actually ask babies this. You can't say, well, what do you think? Do you like that pro-social triangle and dislike that antisocial square? Because they can't answer you. So instead, you have to do something else. And one approach involves looking at how long babies look at a particular situation. Okay? So what you're going to then show babies after they've watched this puppet show is a situation, and I'll just keep the sound turned off for this, in which the circle is going to approach one of these two shapes. And in some cases, the circle is going to approach the helpful triangle. And in other cases, the circle is going to approach the non-helpful square. Okay? And what we're going to do is compare how long babies look to the situation where the circle approaches the helper versus when the circle approaches the hinderer. And here's the key, here's the secret. Babies look longer at things that they find surprising, just like we do, right? So like if I walked to the back of the room and started like breakdancing on the floor, you would all stare at me because you'd be surprised and be like, what is she doing? I didn't expect her to do that. And babies are very similar. If you do something that violates their expectations, they kind of just will look. They'll look longer at those situations than something that feels familiar or something that feels obvious. So what do you think? What do you think would be more surprising? Approaching the helpful triangle or approaching the hindering square? Which is more surprising? The square, right? Because in general we think we don't like to affiliate with people who aren't nice, right? We like to be with people who are nice, people who are helpful. And that's exactly what they found. So when they compared how long the babies looked to approaching the helper or approaching the hinderer, For the 10-month-old babies, there was a very clear pattern. So they look a lot longer when they see the circle approaching that unhelpful square compared to the helpful triangle. Younger babies didn't show that same pattern. So one suggestion here was that maybe babies need some time in the world to kind of start figuring out the difference between good guys and bad guys. Okay? But interestingly, they came up with another way to ask babies what they think as well. So in addition to measuring how long the babies look at these different situations, they also tried this approach of just handing the babies the puppets and then looking to see which ones the babies would grab, which ones they would touch first and want to play with. And when they did that, and here's just an example of a 10-month-old being presented with these little puppets. And they varied which shapes were what. So sometimes the square was the helper, sometimes the circle was the hinderer. And they just measured which one the babies touched. And here they found a really amazing pattern, which was that basically almost 100% of the babies would reach for the helper object over the hinderer. So what's really been incredibly astonishing about these findings is just how young the babies are in these studies who are showing preferences for a cooperative puppet or a cooperative square, which isn't even a real person. And this really suggests potentially an ability or motivation that's much more ingrained, that's much more innate in the human being, that really lends itself well to this cooperation, this putting our heads together. So far I've shown you evidence that humans are very motivated to put their heads together, and that you can see this motivation starting in infancy. But additionally, another thing that humans do that's special is that we, but not chimpanzees, in addition to wanting to cooperate with others, have some really sophisticated tools that we can use for sharing psychological states. And we can use these tools to really supercharge our cooperative activities. And by supercharging them, we sort of amplify what we can do to a really, really high level. So here's an example of one of the tools that we have for sharing psychological states with other people. So let me just present this little scenario to you that many of you might find familiar. So let's imagine that your son comes home from school and throws his backpack on the floor of the living room before running off to his room. You almost trip over the backpack, and so you hang it up in the coat closet to get it out of the way. You get caught up making dinner and forget to tell your son about moving the backpack, okay? Now, an hour later, your son emerges from his room ready to start on his homework, okay? And here's the question for you. Where will your son first look for his backpack?
In the closet, because it's happened so often.
Well, okay. It's an extra sophisticated answer. So maybe he'll look in the closet because you've done this to him a million times, okay? But what's another possibility here? Where might he look? Where he left it, right? Which was in the living room, right?
Then he'll say, Mom!
Yeah, and then he'll yell at you because he'll assume that you moved it somewhere else, and maybe he'll know that it was in the closet. So either of your answers here, whether you're able to infer he's going to look in the living room, that's where he last left it, or even more sophisticated, he's going to look in the closet because he knows that you probably moved it. Both of these require a really sophisticated ability that we call theory of mind. And theory of mind refers to our ability to kind of get inside of other people's heads and know what they're thinking and use what we can infer about what they're thinking to predict their behavior so that we can cooperate with them even more effectively. So when we solve a situation like this, one thing that this really requires of us is that when we encounter another person, we sort of have you and me, the perceiver. So if you and I are interacting here, I know that there's sort of stuff out there in the world that's reality. Okay, so there can be like a physical apple out there in the world. But I'm also able to infer that you have something inside of your head that we call a mental representation of reality. So you can have a thought in your head about an apple, all right? And these two things, this reality and this mental representation of reality, these are not the same thing. They're slightly different, right? So the reality could be that the backpack is in the coat closet, but your son's mental representation of reality is that the backpack is in the living room. These things don't have to match. And what's really important is it's the mental representation of reality. It's what people think inside their heads that predicts their behavior more than actual reality. So because you can infer what's inside the son's head, you can infer that he has a representation that his backpack is where he left it. It's in the living room. You can accurately predict things about his behavior, okay? This seems painfully simple to us, okay? But it's not painfully simple to really young children, and it's not painfully simple to chimpanzees. So this is something that children learn to master by the time they're about 4 years old. And this is done using a task that is very similar in a lot of ways to the situation that I just gave you. This is often called the Sally and Ann task, because that's the name of the puppets that they enact this little scenario with. So we've got Sally up here on the left. This is Sally, and this is Ann. And Sally puts her ball in this basket right here. And then she goes away. She goes outside to play. And while she's outside, Ann, sneaky Ann, moves the ball from the basket to the box. Okay? And then you ask children, you can ask children of a variety of ages, where will Sally look for her ball when she comes back? Okay? And the painfully simple answer to us is that she'll look for her ball in the basket, because that's where she left it. That's where she thinks it is. But what happens is that really young children, so children who up until the age of 4, so 3-year-olds, will give the wrong answer. They'll systematically give the wrong answer, and they'll say that Sally will look for her ball in the box. And if you ask them why, they'll say, because that's where it is. So they seem to reason about behavior based on reality, not based on the inside of the head, not based on the mental representation of reality. And you see really consistent findings across a wide range of cultures in the average age at which children pass this task, the age at which they start to get it right. So really young children are always failing. As they get a little bit older, you get greater and greater percentages of children answering this question correctly. And so by the time you get to like 5- and 6-year-olds, you're about 100% of children can answer this correctly. There are incredibly ambitious researchers who have tried to design nonverbal versions of this task for chimpanzees. And version after version of this with chimps has failed. Chimps cannot solve tasks like this, although chimps are very savvy about what other people know. So for example, if you put them in a situation where they're competing with another chimpanzee for food, they're very sensitive to say what the other chimpanzee has seen and not seen. And they can use information about sort of what's visibly available to the other chimpanzee to kind of make smarter choices about which food they're going to go for. So when they're competing with chimps, they show a lot of evidence that they can make some really smart inferences about what other chimps know. But they're really bad at sort of this thinking about situations where somebody has a false belief about the world, where somebody believes something that's not true, and then using that idea of the mental representation to make a prediction about behavior. So the second tool that we have for supercharging our cooperative activities is language. And language is an incredibly powerful human capacity that allows us to not only gain insight into the contents of other people's heads, but also allows us to manipulate the contents of other people's heads. And this is something I think we often take for granted. So I want you to just think about this for a second. If I just say the word elephant, if I say that word elephant, I am actually changing the contents of your mind just with that simple word. When I say elephant, you all are thinking about an elephant. Maybe you're thinking about what an elephant looks like, or you're thinking about what an elephant sounds like, or thinking about the last time that you saw an elephant. So I can change your heads. I can change your mental representations with a simple word. And this is the incredible power of human language, is that we can string together these symbols and manipulate the contents of other people's heads. And this is incredibly valuable. And it assists us in trying to cooperate and collaborate with others in really important activities. The fact that we have written language, that we have a way of sort of creating a permanent form of language is really valuable for allowing us to share knowledge and skills across generations of people. So language really supercharges our cooperation, not just like within a given generation, but across time, across centuries of time. All right, so an hour ago we started with this question: what makes the human mind unique? And there are many things that we could consider unique about the human mind. But what I've put forward for you is an idea that may be a bit counterintuitive, which is that rather than thinking about humans as just being generally smart, what may be unique about humans is our willingness to cooperate. It's our willingness and capacity for collaboration. It's our willingness to do things with other people, this kind of general helpful nature that we have that allows us to share ideas, to build on the ideas that other people have and that other people before us have had, and to accomplish much greater things together than we could ever accomplish on our own. And with that idea, thank you very much. And I know we're going to take a break and then some questions.
Okay, I want to ask you about the most disturbing thing that I heard in your lecture, and tell me if I have this right. Is it true, are you saying, that my cat does not have an intrinsic motivation to share his inner states with me and is not deriving a natural pleasure from being in my company? Did I hear that right, that that's uniquely human?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'm not sure that cats have a motivation.
They may not even have inner states worth sharing.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's
I don't know.
probably true. Okay,
Yeah.
that's actually not what disturbed me most about the lecture, because I'm going to hold on to the dream for the cat. But what I actually found disturbing, I'd never heard this framed this way before, but it became abundantly clear that it might be true from one of the videos you showed. And that's the idea that humans are hardwired to believe that there is a right way to do something and a wrong way to do something. And if you are one of us, you better do it the right way. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah, I think you are. So I think social psychologists are very well aware of this, that we, at all ages, across all cultures, we do seem to think that there's sort of a right way, at least a right way for our social group to do things, and we really genuinely care about getting that right, about doing things the way that our social group is doing them. And you see examples of this in little kids as well. For example, my daughter's at this age right now where we go to do story time with the library, or she does do gymnastics classes and things, and the teachers at all of these different things that we do have this thing of giving kids a hand stamp at the end. and I've noticed that the kids, all it takes is sort of a couple of kids deciding, I want my stamp on my belly, or I want my stamp on my leg. And then all of the other kids just follow suit. They all just sort of conform because they're inferring okay, this is the right way to get a hand stamp, is on my belly or on my ankle. And I think, so the fact that we see that in such an early age is consistent with this idea that we have this instinct to conform. And conforming really is about figuring out what the right thing to do is in a particular social group.
It's interesting because I've been reading a lot lately, some sociobiologists talking about how this instinct to cooperation is fundamentally human, and so is this other selfish instinct, and that a lot of human problems come about because we are adhering to that selfish instinct rather than the cooperative instinct. But this framing kind of suggests to me that actually a whole bunch of human problems may be based on also this cooperation instinct that comes with it, this fundamental belief that there's a right way to do things. And so if you're not on board with that, then we will make you get on board with that.
Yeah, well, there are some social problems that definitely are amplified because we want to be so like the other people in our social group. So there are these studies done, for example, where you have an experimenter who, as people are coming out of their car in a parking lot, hands them a little leaflet of paper, and then sends them on their way down this corridor on their way to a building. And if you put if you fill the corridor with other little leaflets of paper where it looks like a bunch of people have littered, then people, as they're given this leaflet and walk through the corridor, will throw their paper on the ground. So they do this thing that we all know not to do, you're not supposed to litter, because they're conforming to the norm of the group. And there are a lot of examples of that where we do things that are not especially good or that we wouldn't agree to do, but because everybody else is doing them. So we do sometimes just merrily walk off a cliff with everybody else because we're sort of wired to do that. Yeah.
Cool. So I think social contagion. So I was just, when I was out in the hallway, I found this. I wanted this artifact of being my own little, I'm thinking like a psychologist now, so I wanted to share this with you and share this with all of you. It says the WCC presents problem set party. So college students, they take classes like chemistry or math, computer science, they have these problem sets they have to do. So it says, need help with chem, math problems, getting you down? Come to a problem set party. We'll have tutors, comfy couches, and lots of other people to do your problem sets with. And I thought, that's like how do you make something horrible less horrible? You have comfy couches and lots of other people to do it with. I thought this was such a good example of how we may have this natural instinct to collaborate and to share an activity, even one that seems to be primarily individualistic and goal-oriented. So a question I had for you is, So you have this argument that humans are uniquely good at collaboration and sharing internal states with others. And I'm wondering if there's also research that says we're not just good at it, but we need it in order to be happy or to support our mental health. Do you know, is there research like that?
I don't know. Now I want to go and see if I can find some, because I think that would be a missing piece of the puzzle, right? Like you would definitely predict that if this is something that is really innately human, something that we evolved to do, then we should need to do it, and we should be really upset when we don't do it. I mean, the main kind of research that's coming to mind is the kind of research when you deprive children of being able to connect with another person. So if you rear children in an environment where you stick them in a crib all day and they just have like a hamster water bottle to feed off of and nobody interacts with them, it has really, really bad consequences. I mean, it messes them up for the rest of their lives. I mean, their brains just never develop normally. And so, I mean, that suggests that we clearly need other people. Whether we need people beyond just helping fulfill our basic needs, whether we really need to collaborate, I would predict that we do, but I'm not sure what evidence there is to suggest it. I do know that I think one of the reasons this research has been really meaningful for me is I love to teach. So teaching is what I do, and I definitely feel that it's sort of fulfilling this need in me that I need to share knowledge with people, and there's nothing more exciting than really getting an explanation right where somebody didn't understand something and then I really helped them to understand it. That just feels so good. And so that completely anecdotally tells me that, yeah, there's got to be something there. We need it. But I don't know. I don't know what evidence there actually is to support that right now.
Okay, well, we'll look into that and report back to you all about that. I know that one of the things you didn't talk about that you sometimes discuss as being uniquely human is music. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the evolutionary basis of music or how that functions.
Yeah, music is really is very puzzling for a lot of reasons. So we spend, as a society, we spend more money on music than we do on pharmaceuticals. So you'd think that given how much resources we pump into music, that it must be really important for our survival. Except that no one can really think of how it could be important for our survival. You could imagine you could live without music and you could still find food and you still have kids.
Such a sad life.
Yeah, so it raises this important question of what is music for? What is it good for? Why do people do it? And there are a few ideas about this. One idea is that it's sort of an extension of the way that mothers and children communicate with each other. And this relates to the cooperative aspect of people. So from a really sort of instinctually, when people talk to babies, they have this kind of musical way of talking to them. So they do things like, hi, how are you? Oh, you're such a good girl. Oh, you're such a good girl. And if you really listen to what I'm doing, it's very musical, right? There's this up and down, there's this repetitive pattern. And the reason we talk to babies that way is that babies respond to it really strongly. So it's often been described as kind of this way that we have of touching a baby at a distance. So even if I'm across the room from my daughter, I can talk to her in this way and we connect. It's this way that we have of connecting. And so one idea is that music is basically that connection amplified across larger groups of people. And it's So as one example, there was a study that was done here at Stanford looking at this. If you put people in a lab and you make them, it would have been funny to be in this study. They made them listen to "O Canada," the national anthem of Canada. And while they listened to this song, they made them move these cups back and forth in synchrony with each other. So they were listening to music and going "Oh Canada," and they're doing this back and forth in synchrony with each other, moving together to the music. And what they found was after doing this, after moving to music together, as opposed to moving to music but not in a synchronous way where it's one person's listening to the music offset from the other person, so they're not together, the people who moved to music together, when they performed this later task that measured people's willingness to cooperate, they were more cooperative. And they expected people to be more cooperative because of this experience of listening to music together and moving to music together. And so if you think about examples of when we often use music out in the world, so if you play for a sports team, you listen to music before a game, And we think of it as partly to get you amped up, but the other thing that it does is kind of it synchronizes the group. So it's like getting the group on the same page. It's connecting you all together and getting your minds linked together. It also can signal to other groups that you're competing against, we are together and you better not mess with us. So one great example of this is the New Zealand rugby team, the All Blacks. They perform this thing called the haka before a game, before a match, and it's very musical. It involves like banging their thighs and like kind of chanting together in synchrony. It's ridiculously intimidating to watch. And it's something that cultures have done for centuries, is this kind of thing before they go into battle that says, we are on the same page, we are working together, we are in synchrony, and you are going to get destroyed. And so music is maybe part of this. It's one of these tools that maybe we have for unifying a group and getting people to cooperate, and also getting people to cooperate against other groups. So it's also a way that we work together to do bad things to other people, unfortunately. But I think the cooperative part of it is really fascinating.
So one thing you may not know is that both Bridget and I teach aerobics. We teach group fitness. We teach people to move together to music all the time, where we are initiating the movement and we get everyone in the group to do the same movement at the same time. And when that Stanford study first came out, the O Canada, the Cups, I thought, see, this is why I like teaching aerobics so much, is because everyone in the room, because they're moving with you to music, they bestow such goodwill on you in a way that might never happen in a classroom like this.
Yeah.
And unless we're gonna have hand gestures next time before we start class. And also just the community that builds in a group, doing something silly like doing jumping jacks to hip hop music. That you really have this sense of building community and trust. So we should look for, if you don't already have that in your life, you should go look for some place where you can move to music with other people.
Well, it's part of why I think flash mobs have become this incredible phenomenon. So one of my favorite, I have a video of it. It's incredible. You should look it up on YouTube. So it's a flash mob. It's a Michael Jackson flash mob that was done in Germany, where they had like just hundreds of people dancing to Beat It. And I watched this video clip while I was pregnant last winter, and I had this like incredible emotional reaction to it, like watching these people moving in synchrony, dancing together. I was watching this in my office, and I just like burst into tears, like these like, oh, it's so beautiful. I was just blubbering, and I think it was this thing in my brain being turned on by this power of like groups moving together to music. It was really compelling to me. And I think they should actually do studies of pregnant women listening to music, because I think there are hormones in your body that are about bonding that I think get a little out of whack when you're pregnant, and so some of these things that normally cause that kind of a reaction are like totally amplified when you're pregnant. But yeah, flash mobs I think are another really good example.
Yeah, cool. So there's one other thing I want to ask you about before I turn it over to the group. You focus mostly on what makes humans unique from non-human animals, but I'm wondering if you could just throw out a few tidbits about what the research says about animal capacities that we might be surprised to know that non-human animals share.
Yeah, so I made a whole big deal about how humans point and they understand pointing and chimpanzees don't. And what's been really surprising the last few years is that there is an animal that does understand pointing that's not human. And some of you are nodding because you probably know what it is, and many of you probably have one in your home. So dogs, domestic dogs, are really interesting in their ability to comprehend cooperative communication. And this was discovered because one of the researchers who was doing one of these studies with chimps, Brian Hare, was doing these studies to see if chimps could understand pointing gestures. And he was like, I don't understand why they can't do this. My dog can do this. Like, this is so easy. My dog can do it. And then he thought, why can't my dog do that? And so he brought his dog into the lab. He started bringing other dogs into the lab and testing them. And it turns out that dogs can do this from like puppyhood. They don't need to be taught. Like, puppies can understand pointing gestures. You can rig up a little situation where that you're hiding food in different places, and you can use pointing gestures, and they completely, without needing to be taught, will understand them and use them. Wolves do not do this. Mm-hmm. So you can also test wolf puppies, and they can't do it. And so it seems to be something that we have bred into the dog psyche. that probably relates to the fact that we cooperate with dogs. So we use dogs as service animals. They help us herd sheep and do all sorts of things where we need to cooperate with them. We need them as partners. And so we have over time created these characteristics basically in dogs that allow them to do what we often expect a person to do. So that's been one really surprising thing. The other thing is that chimpanzees are really a lot smarter than I've made them out to be today. They have a lot of sophisticated abilities to reason about the contents potentially of another chimpanzee's mind. And we're learning more and more about this over time, but what has been useful in doing this is realizing that if you want to understand what a chimpanzee really knows, you need to put them in a situation where they can compete against another chimpanzee. And it's in that situation that all of their intelligence really comes to bear. If you put them in situations where they have to cooperate, they look stupid because they don't expect to cooperate like we do. And so that's been a really surprising thing too. They can do a lot of the things that we can do. It's just that they don't reveal them in the same situations. So those are the two that really stick out.
You've worked with chimps, right? Can you say a little something about that?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate, the first research experience that I got to have in psychology was working at a lab down in Georgia, where there are a bunch of, they have monkeys and they have chimpanzees, and they also at the time had bonobos, which are a type of chimpanzee. They're just as genetically similar to us as chimpanzees are, but they're different in a lot of ways. And they, yeah, you're chuckling because you know some of the ways they're different. They were doing a lot of studies down there looking at sort of all different aspects of how monkeys think and chimpanzees think. And they also were doing some of the chimpanzee language training studies down there. So this was the facility where at the time they had Kanzi, the bonobo. Some of you may have heard of Kanzi. So he's the ape that has come closest to mastering certain aspects of human language. And he was there at the time. So I got to work down there for a little while, and it was really interesting. This is where I really learned that chimpanzees and monkeys are kind of scary. And you don't think about that because you see like cute versions of them on TV. What you don't know is that normally the chimpanzees you see in movies and television are juveniles. They're really young because young ones are easier to control. Like once they're grown-ups, they're like, they're really aggressive. The first time I actually got to meet one of the chimps, as soon as I walked in the room, he immediately like puffed up all of his hair and started running around the room like crazy, banging into everything that he could to make as much noise as possible because he wanted me to know that he was in charge and that I should not mess with him. So they're very aggressive. And you spend a lot of time behind plexiglass so that they don't do things to you.
There's probably some human form of that too.
Yes, there is definitely some human form
like
of that.
Like sitting
too.
on the highest chair so we know who's in charge.
Yeah, but there were other things too. So there was a bonobo, a baby bonobo there at the time named Inyota, who was he was being trained to use these different symbols to communicate with different experimenters who were there. And so one of the neatest things was when I would pull in sometimes in the morning, and Yoda would be in the parking lot where I was working with his caregiver, and he'd be just sitting there in like a diaper and Birkenstock sandals, and they would be like drawing symbols in chalk on the sidewalk, and they were teaching him to use these different symbols to refer to different kinds of food and things. And so that was definitely one of the nicer ends of it.
Do you believe this? I know I'm asking all the questions, but I love this topic, and this will be the last one, I promise. Do you believe the stuff about animals doing art? Do you think that non-human animals are actually artistic? Because you've seen them, there are whole gallery shows about elephants that paint and gorillas who draw and even cats who dance. And do you think that that's actually art, or is that something you'd put in the uniquely human category?
So that raises a big question, which is what counts as art? My dad's actually an artist, so this is something that I've thought about a lot. I mean, I definitely think that an elephant or a gorilla can just enjoy the process of like exploring paint. I mean, I think, you know, a 2-year-old likes to splatter paint on a canvas and see what happens. Like I think that the playful aspect of art is not uniquely human. The fact that we just like to play and see what happens when we do this, like just for the fun of it, I think that that is really shared. But the part of art that involves like, I'm gonna try to communicate something specific about this landscape, or that I wanna take this landscape and paint it in a way that breaks this particular convention. That's the stuff that I think is uniquely human. Where
Or
there's
that
like,
I want you to feel something that comes from my inner experience and then becomes your
right,
inner
right. So you can
experience.
think of art as being a medium for sharing psychological states, right? So we produce art sometimes to make people feel the way that we feel or to make them see something the way that we see something. And that, I think, lends the more like uniquely human character to art. Whereas just the playing with stuff, I think a lot of animals would do that.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to let you call on folks as you would like, and I'll let you know when we are out of time.
Okay. Questions? Yeah.
So I find it very interesting to emphasize our capacity to collaborate as a way of understanding something about us, but I don't see it as uniquely human at all. It seems to me I've heard of all kinds of things with other animals that show the same characteristics, and I had an experience myself I told Kelly about. I have a koi pond, and one of my koi took himself out and was almost dead, and we put him back in. He didn't move at all, and then the other koi came on either side of him, and for the next hour basically gave him physical therapy, moved him through and got his gills working until he came back
Oh, that's fascinating.
to life. So that's pretty cooperative.
Yeah.
And
Now,
those are fish.
you are completely right. Humans are not the only species that cooperates. And there are some really extreme forms of cooperation that are more extreme than what we do. So like honeybees, for example, I mean, there will be like a queen bee, and then all of her sisters will sacrifice their own reproduction. They won't bear offspring. All they do is serve their sister. That's extreme, like pro-social behavior. So pro-social behavior you find all over the natural world. So I guess when I'm pointing to sort of what is uniquely human, I think the comparison group that I'm most interested in there are what our sort of closest ancestors and closest cousins are like. So what is it, in our evolution that pushed us in a direction that's different from a chimpanzee or a bonobo or a gorilla? So what is the sort of the uniquely human little bend in the twig of our family tree that pushes us off in one way? But there are a lot of other species that, for different reasons than ours, have evolved cooperative abilities. So we're not the only ones that cooperate, and certainly there are examples of pro-social behavior in animals that seem even more like self-sacrificing than what we do. But when you compare us to other primates, to gorillas and chimps and orangutans and moving further away, monkeys, we are way more cooperative than they are. So this is a very good point, because I certainly don't want anybody to walk away thinking like, oh gosh, humans are really special because we're the only ones that cooperate, and that's not quite true. I need to clarify that a bit. So thank you for that. Yeah.
In the experiment with the kids, in the 15-second interval of disengagement, it was interesting that it looked like they were communicating the joy and the pleasure of working together, maybe in an effort to re-engage them.
Yeah, so somebody pointed out that they were smiling. And the fact that the children were willing to play these social games where there's nothing to be gained. They're not getting a toy from this. They're not getting anything from this besides just like, I get to play this game with you. That's incredibly rewarding for them, just in and of itself. And we see this like in our own kids. I mean, my daughter just wants to do things with me. It doesn't matter if she's getting anything out of it. She just wants to participate. She just wants to do together. And that's the part of it that I think is very different in humans from chimpanzees. Yeah, it's a really good point. I know you had a question back there. Yeah.
I wanted to know, as female chimps mature and reach adulthood and then become pregnant and have offspring, that competitive behavior clearly changes. And so there must be a period of time in which something different happens for the female chimp. And I'm wondering if anybody has tried to figure out is that a biochemical thing? Or how is it that they learn the cooperative behavior between a mother and child?
So there's a few pieces to that are interesting. So one is a question of whether chimpanzee mothers cooperate with children the same way that human mothers do. And that's really interesting. Michael Tomasello has actually shown video clips, and he gives talks around the world about this stuff, showing a human mother like handing food to her child, which human mothers do. We make food for our children, we hand it to them. And then he shows a video clip of a chimpanzee mother interacting with her child. And the chimpanzee mother basically tolerates her child taking food away from her. So there's something that feels qualitatively different about the way that chimps mother their children, where they're certainly allowing the children to have food, but it's not the same like, I'm going to do all this for you and give it to you. It's a little bit more of a tolerance, which is really interesting. But another piece of your question is in general, motherhood involves a lot of pro-social behavior, the self-sacrificing. I'm going to give up my time and my energy, my food, my resources to help you, and whether there's some kind of biological basis for that happening. And I think the biological basis differs in different species, but there very clearly is. And this is part of what that hormone cocktail is intended to do after people give birth, is just completely rewires your brain so that you're just like, yes, deprive me of sleep, I'll do anything for you. We really just go gung-ho to help our children. I don't know a lot about the specifics of the chemical basis in humans or in chimpanzees, but there are definitely biologists who are studying that specifically and trying to nail down how chemicals influence pro-social behavior in that really specific situation. Yeah.
I guess from seeing the experiments, I felt like I was only getting half the story, or the question is, what is being proved? In the sense that if the babies clearly have been trained before the point they walk into this experiment by lots of eye contact, lots of reinforcement, lots of other things to react in certain kinds of ways. These experiments aren't in a vacuum. In the second dimension, you show, or in the movies, the children are in extremely trusting situations. They're with caregivers, everybody's laughing and smiling. They're being given tremendous positive reinforcement. And it's a very safe environment. And which I don't necessarily see that that's the context for the chimpanzees. And I also don't see, if you had a chimpanzee trained to perform the act of the experimenter, and so the one-year-old baby is then trying to do these things with a chimpanzee on the other side of the plexiglass, I would somehow be more convinced that this wasn't about, the difficulty of communicating across species.
Interesting.
So presumably those experiments have been done, but I just don't know.
Yeah. So you're raising a good question, which is that there's a lot of other factors that we haven't talked about. So, how much does it matter whether chimps are tested with a human versus with a chimp? How much does it matter whether the chimps are really familiar with the human they're being tested? The study that I showed you with the chimps and children doing these cooperative activities, in that study, the chimps were tested with a caregiver that they knew really, really well, who they'd known for years, who they had worked with, and from whom they would have had many opportunities to learn to use cooperative cues, to use communicative cues that young children do. And so, one interesting puzzle is that when you do raise chimps by humans, they don't learn the same things that kids do. So kids, do potentially learn to use eye contact and to point, to do these things to try to get somebody's attention. But chimps, given the same, as close of an upbringing as you can create for a chimpanzee, don't seem to learn those things in the same way. Because a lot of these chimps that have been tested have been brought up by humans. They're much more familiar with humans than they are with other chimpanzees.
But one has to picture the reverse experiment, don't you? Which is, what if a baby was brought up by chimpanzees?
Yeah.
Would you result in the same level of cooperative behavior?
No, I don't think you would. And I think part of that is that, so nature and nurture are always interacting, right? And so humans may have some little sort of innate thing that makes us more cooperative, and then that gets amplified as we do cooperate. So as we start interacting with other people, and other people treat us in this cooperative way, this helpful way, and we receive that, a lot of our tendency to cooperate may get bigger, it may get amplified. Whereas if you were raised by a chimpanzee, you may have this cooperative tendency, but nobody is meeting it. They're not cooperating with you. They're not helping you. You have nothing to gain by being cooperative. If anything, you might lose out by being cooperative, and so that behavior gets stomped down. So yeah, I mean, we would never say that humans have this hardwired program. This is how they are. They're cooperative. They're going to be this cooperative no matter how you raise them. It's always going to be the case that being then brought up by other humans changes these things in different ways. It's a very good point. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, others. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak to, like you were saying, that cooperation isn't only human, and that you were looking at our particular branch of our family tree.
Mm-hmm.
If we looked at a different branch of a different part of the family tree of
Mm-hmm.
all life, then say crows or ravens being socially smarter than some other kind of bird, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it is that makes humans so vastly different from the rest of the animal kingdom than crows being not very different than a canary or something
Okay,
like
I
that?
see. So you're saying if you look at some other parts of the natural world, if you compare birds to each other, they'll be different. They'll show some differences. Crows and ravens actually are really smart, but they'll show some differences. Whereas in the human family tree or the primate family tree, it's like you've got the monkeys and the apes, and then humans are out here in left field, or we just do all these crazy things. And I think a big part of the argument I'm trying to make today is that part of the reason we are way out here in left field so different is because when humans start pooling their mental resources together, when we start putting our heads together, these amazing things start to happen. That you take a level of intelligence. If you could take the level of intelligence of a chimpanzee and get them to cooperate in the way that we do, you might start getting a whole snowball of other kinds of things that we do. So it's this one tiny little difference potentially between humans and chimps, this willingness to cooperate, that this tiny little difference that snowballs and turns into this huge difference that makes us look so dramatically different from other species. But then there's another question that follows from that, which is, let's say you've got a bunch of species of honeybees, and you get this one particular subspecies that suddenly becomes more cooperative. Why don't they suddenly become like humans? And you have to take into account other stuff too. It's not just that humans are cooperative, but we also have other mental capacities for thinking about the world, for representing things in the world. So for example, we can use symbols. We make things like maps. We use words, which are symbols to represent other things, and maybe that matters too. So there's some other stuff that we didn't talk about today that might also contribute to why humans really, really diverge a lot. Yeah.
When you were talking about the cooperation, I was thinking about horses. In particular, their motivation for cooperating is very mysterious to me.
That's interesting. I don't know much about horses, and now I want to find out. Because I wonder how much you might see. So in the same way we see domestic dogs, being able to understand human cooperative communication, that horses might show a lot of those abilities too. And I don't know of anybody who's doing research on horses, but somebody should, because you could predict that they might understand, maybe not pointing per se, but there are other maybe cooperative gestures and things that they would really get.
Body language is picked up, and they'll learn extremely gentle management and abide by it exquisitely. And so it's a funny thing where years ago they used to kind of whip them into shape, and now they're sort of really gently encouraging, and it's a completely different language, and they're trying to compare that and how we work together versus forcing somebody to abide by something and encouraging them to enlist.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a whole slew of animals that we work with that you might expect to see some really special abilities in that are more like what we do. So dogs, horses, any others? What others? Dolphins. Well, dolphins are really special in a lot of ways, although we don't use dolphins as service animals. So they're not ones that we cooperate directly with. But dolphins are interesting. And they're, Yeah, I need to, there's a lot about dolphins. I'm going to go off on like a huge dolphin tangent. Dolphins are incredibly smart, and they do a lot of things actually that chimpanzees don't, but that we do. And they do those things for very different reasons than we do, because they've evolved in a totally different track than we have. But dolphins can provide a really interesting window actually into human evolution, because you can consider other aspects of sort of dolphin social structure and things like that that might have shaped how they are, why they are the way that they are, and how those things might mimic some of the things that humans have as well. Yeah.
Last question.
Okay, yeah.
The next time I see a baby point, it will be so meaningful to me now. But my question is, with your baby and seeing her point, do you think she learned that specifically from you, or is it an innate thing with children?
I think that she learned to point, probably from watching me, but I don't think she learned, I don't know how she learned to understand pointing from watching me. The understanding of pointing, I think she just sort of derived on her own. Because I think we don't teach children to understand pointing. We don't like point and then like physically force their heads around or do other things like that. I mean, we just sort of do it and they just start picking up on it. But making the pointing gesture, they probably do imitate that and learn that. And we have other ways of pointing besides using our hands that we also learn from others too. So like you can point with your face, for example. Like you can ask somebody like, where's the bathroom? And they go, oh, it's over there. And like they just use their head to point in that direction. So there's a lot of ways that we can point besides using our hands, and we learn a lot of those ways of pointing from watching others. Yeah.
Okay. Do an experiment where a mother points with her foot.
With her foot?
That's all it does.
Yeah, and see if the kids start doing that instead.
Yeah.
They probably would. Great. Well, thank you guys so much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.